Joining us this afternoon is Julia Stoddart, and Julia is a recently appointed Chief Operations Officer for a magnificent part of the world, really, the JAHAMA Highland Estates, which are up in Scotland, just north of Fort William, in a very wild and rugged part of the United Kingdom. And Julia and I spoke, must be several months ago now, with the view to having this conversation. And in the meantime, she's sort of given some thought to a number of key things that she thinks as a leader of an organization that's very varied and has all sorts of different strands to it, things that are sort of important to her. So I'm just going to let her introduce herself, chat about what she's involved in, and a little bit about JAHAMA Estates. Julia, lovely to see you. Thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. It's really kind of you to invite me on to talk about this incredible estate that I have the privilege of looking after. Yeah. So I'm a rural chartered surveyor. That's my profession, although I came to that via a slightly winding route, starting more in the conservation land management sector before qualifying as a land agent, as a chartered surveyor. And then I've also worked in lobbying, in land management related policy before coming to JAHAMA Highland Estates in November last year. So JAHAMA Highland Estates is an unprecedented landholding. It's about 114,000 acres of the Scottish Highlands. So yeah, one of Scotland's larger estates. But what's so interesting about it is that it's part of the GFG Alliance, and that's a Gupta family group alliance of companies. So our principal is a chap called Sanjeev Gupta, yeah. and he's a global businessman. He's a disruptor in his sector, which is heavy industry, so metals, energy, and other things as well. The GFG is quite a wide-ranging group of businesses in itself. And so his key thing, Sanjeev's key thing, is sustainability. Right. So looking at greening the metals industry, and renewable energy is a really important part of that. And that is why he came to, or the GFG came to own the estate. So JAHAMA Highland Estates has quite a long and interesting pedigree. It's 91 years of history. It was first brought together as a single landholding in the early 1900s by the old British Aluminium Company. Right, yeah. And it was acquired from various aristocratic landowners of the Tweedy type that you can probably imagine, early 1900s stereotypes of landowners in that part of the world, to secure the water catchment for hydro stations. And there's one at the village of Kinlochleven in the south end of the estate, and then one in Fort William. So the water catchment is extensive and covers the whole 114,000 acres. And the water is collected in reservoirs and then piped in a series of tunnels to the two respective power stations. Sure. So the reason for that was that the BA back in the early 1900s thought that this is a great way to produce aluminium. Initially for the First World War, the war effort, and then latterly, of course, for the Second World War. And aluminium was a really important product and still is globally. It's a very important metal. And it takes a lot of electricity to smelt it. It's a really complex process in some ways. And so having a cheap source of renewable energy within the business for the BA, the British Aluminium at the time, was ideal. So they captured all this water and they took it into the power stations and they smelted aluminium at a smelter in Kinlochleven, which sadly has since closed, and at the smelter in Fort William. And that's still open, which is with the only aluminium smelter left in the UK, and it's powered by renewable energy. So its carbon footprint is much lower than a smelter would otherwise have. And of course, in a part of the Highlands that is characterised by service industry employment, agriculture and forestry, so and some primary industries like those, it's a great source of employment and very important to the local economy. And it is a key part of all that.
Well, I think I mentioned during our previous conversation, you know, I've spent a lot of time working with the Norwegian company, Hydro. Yeah. They're in a similar situation where hydroelectricity drove, you know, the smelting plants, which are often in areas where employment opportunities are pretty few and far between, unless, you know, you can get a job at the smelter.
Yeah, exactly that. So The BA was then bought over by subsequent companies and eventually by GFG 3 years ago, roughly in about 2016. Yeah. And GFG acquired the whole land holding. And I think it's fair to say that previous owners didn't really pay too much attention to the estate, to the rural land holdings that came with the water catchment. And Sanjeev, being the visionary that he is, he looks at this acquisition and thought, okay, this is something really exciting we can do a lot with for sustainability. And so I am a new appointment, relatively speaking, merely in the job for a year, to drive forward, or to put in place and drive forward a new management strategy for the whole land holding. Yeah. And again, being part of GFG, the core of our vision for the estate is sustainability. Right. So we're looking to achieve equity across the 3 pillars of sustainability, kind of looking at the Brundtland definition of that word, sustainable development phrase. So the economy, society, and the environment, all very important. Some of them needing more input than others, depending on which part of the estate we're looking at, hence equity rather than balance or one of those words.
So what are the, I mean, you've been in place just about a year. I mean, gosh, there must be all sorts of challenges, but I mean, specifically in terms of, you know, the leadership, what are some of the things that you're finding you're having to focus on, or the things that you have at the, you know, the back of your mind that steer you to some of the decisions that you have to make? I
think having a principal like Sanjeev Gupta is really valuable, because he sets a clear remit, right. Sustainable development and regeneration of this incredible landholding. Because when you think of estates, rural estates, what does one think of? Farming, forestry, sporting activity, maybe some cottages, that kind of stuff. But actually where we are in the West Highlands, and we actually touch into the Kengal National Park as well, such as the kind of magnitude of the landholding. Yes, all of those things are there and they're all important enterprises for us, but there's a lot more going on as well. We have the north face of Ben Nevis, for example, and we have a significant part of Glen Nevis. Yeah. So tourism and recreation are huge, huge things for us on the estate. We also have some commercial sites that are as yet undeveloped in Fort William town, and also in some of the outlying villages as well. So that's an additional element too. And we work closely with Alvance, which is the aluminium part of the group,
right,
and CIMEC, which is the hydro energy part of the group. So we work with them and assist them with their endeavours too, because we're all interlinked. The hydro infrastructure is on the estate. So, you know, we inevitably work closely. And what's the reason we're all here? Well, it's the production of aluminium in Fort William now. So that, again, is a key part. And I think, you know, that brings challenges inevitably. Trying to run a multi-enterprise rural business in the Scottish Highlands in 2020 is not a simple task. But that's where the potential lies. And the fact that previous owners didn't really do much with it has ironically created that vast potential, that now we have an owner that is passionate about regenerating the whole region. We can do something with that potential and unlock it. So there are, talking of where are my challenges and where are my focus areas, this year really has been a bedding in process for me. Yeah. It's not even year zero, it's sort of year -1 in some ways. But the first thing that I did was take the draft management strategy and vision that had been looked at by one of our board members. And I redrafted that and finalized that, and we've published that. So that's available on our website if people want to learn more about it, because it is quite wide ranging. And with that in place, that set the scene, and that set the overarching goal that we could then look at specific projects to start delivering on that vision and delivering on our strategic objectives. Inevitably, there has been some feet finding and some reactionary work, but such is the nature of a new job anywhere, let alone one as complex as this on such a complex landholding.
But you must have, I mean, I was just thinking, you know, on previous conversations we've had, you must have an enormous range of different stakeholders, you know, whether it's the local community, whether it's the group of companies that you represent, you know, on the ground, presumably I don't know whether the Highland and Islands Development Authority still exists in the old days, but the whole of the government sort of area, the environment, and the scientific importance and things like that. I mean, there must be numerous different stakeholders, and you're having to juggle those relationships.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, and actually, it's more of a people management role in some ways than a land management role.
Right, interesting.
I would say, because all of the challenges or conflicts that arise, they may be related to land, but ultimately they're all to do with people.
Yeah.
And people's different perceptions and people's expectations and people's wishes. I'm fortunate to work in Scotland. As you can probably tell, I'm not from Scotland. I'm English, but I've been up here for quite a few years. And I like working here because there is this focus on community involvement in land management. Land reform is an ongoing journey driven by the Scottish Government, and I'm very much keen on that. I think it's a fascinating time to be working in land management in Scotland. And yeah, stakeholders, we have many. Some internal, as you mentioned, the various different businesses within GFG, and we're spread out all over the world as well. So in the UK, our HQ is London, and I speak with people down there quite a lot, but we also have some in the West Midlands too, and other parts of the UK, but also in other countries around the world. And we're all working to deliver on the GFG vision of sustainable development. So we've got a lot in common, but we sometimes approach things in different ways, because I'm a land manager ultimately, and I've got other colleagues who are in the metals industry, or in the energy industry, or in the banking industry, and we all approach life with a slightly different view. So that's one part. And then the external stakeholders are myriad, from Scottish Government, very senior politicians and civil servants who are very interested in what we're doing on the estate for obvious reasons. Highlands and Islands Enterprise, you mentioned, yes, they are a key stakeholder as well. The local council, the Highland Council, the Chamber of Commerce as well in Loch Harbour, which is very active and very exciting to be part of that. And then the community, you said community, Matthew, didn't you? Communities, we have plural. Being such a large estate, there are many different communities of geography, but also of interest as well.
Yeah.
And it's my job to ensure that all of those people feel listened to, and that they feel involved with the estate. And genuinely so. This isn't a lip service thing at all. We genuinely want people to feel as though they are heard and listened to, and I take their views into account when I am making management decisions on the estate, which is complex because there are lots of competing views.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a very public estate in a sense. It is so large and so wide-ranging. It's not that you could sort of keep under the radar and just quietly go on doing what you're doing. Whether you like it or not, you're in everyone's faces everywhere they turn. It must be it must take up, I should think it's challenging in an interesting sense, but it must take up a lot of your time trying to sort of make sure that the various different stakeholders and communities do feel, as you say, that they're being listened to, even if maybe on occasions you have to end up making a decision that's not quite what they particularly would like.
Yeah, definitely. And community engagement is what we do, really. I have a member of staff whose entire job, he's a full-time member of staff, and his entire job is dedicated to that. He's my liaison manager, a great chap called John Hart. And John is brilliant because he's exactly the right kind of person to be doing that extensive engagement work with all kinds of people from all walks of life across the whole area that we cover. And it sounds overwhelming, doesn't it? Because I'm doing the doing most of the time. I don't very often talk actually about what I do. So this is quite a novelty for me, Matthew. But it sounds really complex. But in a way, the micro of it is, but the macro isn't, because our vision is so clear.
Yeah.
And as a leader, as the principal of the estate, well, clearly I have a boss, Jay Hambro, who is a senior member of GFG, and also gets Sanjeev's vision and is fully on board with all of that, which is really helpful for me. But it's my job is easier because I have that overarching remit. And yes, there are competing interests within that remit, but that goal is always sitting there. And so I know that when I'm in a challenging situation and I have maybe 2 or 3 different interests wanting different things from me, I just rein it back to that and think, well, how do I deliver the vision while listening to these people's views? It's not as complex perhaps in practice as it sounds in theory.
No, you have, but it's interesting because you've mentioned it a few times in a different way, that sitting above everything that you might get embroiled with, drawn into, is this overarching vision that the group has right across the world and implements it maybe in different ways, but has this vision. And therefore you've got something as a leader that you can go back to and say, right, I need to make a decision on this. There are lots of different vested interests, but actually if I take the vision, the overriding principles we work to, then it helps me make the decisions that I've got to make. Or it gives some steerage. Yeah,
it's I guess it's sort of like a framework.
Yeah.
And there are lots of moving parts, and there are different ways that you can interpret sustainable development. Yeah. And inevitably there are trade-offs, always. Yeah. In land management, always. It's impossible to have it any other way. But, and also as a leader, I'll have people seeking different things from me for their own reasons. And that is only right because I'm in an unusual position where I have to balance all of these interests across a complex landholding, but also it's a complex business, remember, as well. I think sometimes it's that estates are businesses these days, especially. But yeah, it's coming back to that remit is always, it's got to be the foundation. It's our principles, and it helps that I personally believe in that as well. Sometimes as chartered surveyors, we're required to implement different professional decisions to perhaps what we would choose to do for ourselves personally. And I do feel very fortunate to be in a role where my personal beliefs and my professional requirements, my professional job align, because that's not actually that common.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. We've got a COVID dog barking in the back. You might hear. Yeah.
Mine will start in a minute when he hears yours.
Yeah, something's obviously being delivered to the front door. I think I know what it is, but I'm not going to go and have a look. But you mentioned when we were sort of setting this conversation up, one of the things you said was explain but don't justify, and that really interested me because I can think of all sorts of situations where I've been with people, and I've done it myself, where you try to justify something and you just feel an enormous hole being dug by you and everyone else. And it makes everything so much more unnecessarily complicated. So where did that come from, that gem of wisdom?
Experience, Matthew, that's where that came from. Look, I think it's easy, especially as a landowner in a country that's on a journey to land reform. And what does land reform mean? Well, it ultimately is, you can break it down in different ways, but it's about giving local people and ordinary people a say in the management of the natural resources that surround them. So it's easy to get drawn into feeling like you need to defend your position as a private landowner's representative, because very often private landowners are criticised in Scotland, and sometimes with good reason and sometimes with less good reason. But of course, there is polarity in this debate, as you and I have discussed before. So it's my view and my leadership style, and I do this with my staff as well as with stakeholders, is it's important to me that people understand why I make the decisions I make. And that's important to me because I want people to feel involved. And that's part of community engagement, and not having the them and us, having the much closer relationship. And so there's a difference between explaining and justifying. And as soon as you start justifying, you're in defensive mode, which suggests that you have something to defend, and then you're getting into conflict, and we don't want to be in conflict, because a lot of conflict in land management, in rural business management in Scotland, is artificial. In my view, is that it's very often based on perceptions and miscommunications than a genuine conflict. So an explanation is, okay, this is my decision, and this is the reason that I've reached this decision. So it's an explanatory process. I could probably give you an example, but I'm struggling to think of one right now. But it's an important difference, in my opinion, and that an explanation is much more engaging, it's much more proactive, it's much more positive. And people can disagree with you, but if they understand why you've done something, I feel that goes some way to rebalancing a potential conflict. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think that's, and I think it's because, I mean, it's true in every situation, I think, but because your situation, you have so many different people looking at you, watching what you're doing, having an interest, and sometimes a critical interest in what's going on, then explaining, yes, but justifying, I could imagine the drain on your energy of constantly going into that sort of mode of being defensive about something must be, you know, very tiring. And the other thing I also picked up on, because we've had some conversations you know, with others about adaptive leadership. That I'm passionately interested in, although I don't know much about it. But I love this point you put here: to wait on definitive knowledge is to wait for eternity. In the meantime, try things out, and if they don't work, you know, learn and move on, basically. That to me seems like really good advice for any leader, and particularly a young leader. You know, this convincing yourself it has to be perfect.
It doesn't.
No.
Being wrong is not necessarily a bad thing, because that's how you learn. And I can't take credit for that quote about definitive evidence. That came from a Leslie Riddoch book that I was reading. Yeah. And she's quite right that definitive evidence is something that crops up again and again in land management, especially when we're looking at habitat management and wildlife management, that we're always looking for proof of making the right decision. But proof in that kind of environment is a very difficult thing. In fact, it probably doesn't exist definitively, hence the quote. In the meantime, as a leader, you can't be paralyzed by worrying about making an imperfect decision, because paralysis is, I mean, gosh, what's that? There's another phrase, I don't know who came up with it, but, you know, the road of life is paved with dead squirrels that couldn't make a decision. So you have to get on and make decisions. And actually, if you were to ask me what my job is, it is a series of decision-making days. So every single day there could be scores of decision requests that come across my desk, and some of those decisions are very easy for me to make and take a few seconds. Some of them are much harder and longer and require hours of research. But you have to get on with it. Leadership is about forward movement and leading people forward and taking them on that journey with you. And you can only do that by being authentic and being human and making mistakes and learning from them, ideally, is being human, because we are not perfect. We are not machines. We are animals. We're creatures. Yeah. And we are all on a learning journey. Even the greatest leaders who are nearing the end of their careers are still on that journey. And I think the more we talk about that and openly accept it, the better, because this idea that you have to be perfect and you're never going to make a cock up is just not realistic, frankly.
Oh, well, Julia, I think on that happy note, you know, I'm conscious that we've been chatting for about 25 minutes. It's been wonderful. And thank you. You know, thank you so much for sharing your insights and thoughts. I mean, I would imagine it's a wonderful job to have in many ways. It's unique. Yeah, it must be unique, given all the, and in a beautiful part of the world, even though, as you explain, you're not even living there yet. But hopefully next time we chat, you'll have had the house built or moved into wherever it is you're going to be living. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been great talking to you, really.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Matthew. As I say, it's a strange experience for me talking about what I do rather than doing it, but I really appreciate the chance to talk through some of these issues, especially the more philosophical ones. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. So thank you.
Pleasure. It's been great fun.